Two.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this continuation of an incredible dialogue with the new untouchables across the country. And we're recording this on Thursday, May 15th, 2025 at approximately 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I am so pleased to be joined by one of the new untouchables, of course, the great Marc Dann, who is a former Attorney General of the great state of Ohio and currently in practice, as you can see, with Dann Law. And we're joined today by his colleague, David Marburger, who happens to be one of the foremost experts in the state of Ohio, maybe even throughout the country, as it relates to the First Amendment and all things that we're going to discuss today that hopefully will provide you further evidence and understanding of what we're in the midst of and what can be done to hopefully turn the tables on what seems to be as antithetical to everything that we think of when we think of democracy. So welcome to you both. Marc, I think I'm going to start with the question with you. Maybe you can kind of set up the idea of what should constitute the direction of this dialogue. But I know that we've been talking behind the scenes, particularly as it relates to First Amendment issues, particularly as it relates to transparency in government, as well as libel issues and the great expanse of social media. So on that note, let's start there, because it seems to me that we are in the midst of the Armageddon of misinformation, disinformation, and how do we actually engage that in a way that can turn the tables that will be useful to the American people?
Right. As lawyers, we struggle with what can we do? What can we do? Use the tools we have to create an environment where there's going to be reliable information that is accessible to people who want to and to educate the public about the things that are going on, and how can we use the courts to make that happen. Trump and his and the MAGA movement has done an incredible job of weaponizing the courts and the First Amendment claims to advance their own causes and to advance the cause of misdirection and mistruth. And so the question for today is how do we marshal the same type of resources and the same type of tactics in favor of actual truthful, verified, fact-checked discussions of public policy going forward.
Well, what a remarkable way to open up the dialogue. And David, I mean, one of the things that we have discovered throughout these ongoing podcasts is, quite frankly, the discovery of what some might frame as libel in some cases. I recently had interviewed David Enrich, the business editor of the New York Times, who wrote this wonderful book called Murder the Truth. And we went through this entire sort of spectrum of understanding how billionaires could do exactly what Marc had just suggested: weaponize the court system to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate in a completely perverted, manipulative way that continues to deliver all sorts of incredible misinformation and what many of us consider propaganda in lieu of this, Doge and Trump presidency and all things attacking on the First Amendment. I'm wondering if you could start us off with an understanding of the First Amendment, how it applies to this, and also the transparency that Marc alluded to.
Applies. When you say this, what do you mean by this?
Well, just in general, what are we looking at in terms of, I guess, to frame the question initially, the overload of social media to be able to deliver what, in the relationship of X, for example, I have observed, and I could continue to observe, thousands of lies per second.
I have no doubt of that.
That go on.
No doubt of that.
And then there's a lot of people that are actual victims of that in the public sphere. And of course, I know there's a higher threshold for celebrities or politicians and that sort of thing. I mean, we could start with, for example, the right's attack on Hillary Rodham Clinton forever. And I've always been a little bit, why didn't we see more of a larger pushback from somebody with the resources like Hillary and, of course, Mark Elias and the Democratic Party and everything else? But they kind of sat on this while we've seen literally the purveyors of misinformation and lies at a level never before seen that would, and then after winning the presidency for however that worked out, but ultimately within social media and then all things misinformation. I mean, this fire hose of propaganda is legal.
Yeah, it's legal. In general, it's legal. What the internet did, that we remember before the internet, there were also propagandists in our society. There were people who spewed handbills that were filled with misinformation, libelous and non-libelous. There were people who, wrote published fringe newspapers that they'd hand out on the streets that took positions that were false, complete baloney. Well, look, I can remember when, and it probably still exists, when if I'm waiting in the cashier's line at the grocery store, there would be tabloids that would tell me about aliens that are living among me, and they'd have a woman who had just been released by an alien spaceship. I mean, falsehoods and misinformation are not new to our society. What's new is the fullness of the dissemination of it. Right now, before the internet, there was an economic barrier to mass communicating misinformation. The economic barrier was you had to be able to print it, you had to be able to distribute it. And to do what the newspapers did or the television stations did to distribute information was an enormous economic undertaking that the average person could never afford or rarely afford. So the falsehoods and the misinformation were not so pervasive because it was hard to distribute them. Enter the internet. Anybody with an internet connection, a keyboard, and a PC or a Mac is suddenly a mass communication publisher. It's so easy to publish to millions of people now, and there is virtually no economic obstacle to that. But that alone, I think, would not be the source of the problem. Principally, it's social media. Social media provides apparently a very enticing way for people to communicate false information, alarming information, ridiculous information to everybody else. And therein lies a problem. The problem is maybe best illustrated this way. For a newspaper, let's take a daily newspaper like the Plain Dealer. If it published your letter to the editor, and your letter to the editor said something defamatory about somebody else, something false and disparaging about somebody else, the Plain Dealer is liable for publishing that, even though the Plain Dealer took no position on what you had to say in your letter. Even if the Plain Dealer was entirely neutral, said nothing, it was liable for it as though the Plain Dealer had written the letter. Take the same letter and make it a comment on Cleveland.com, which no longer has comments, but it used to. And Cleveland.com was owned by the same, essentially, there was a corporate distinction between the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com, but for all practical purposes, it's the same people, the same owners that own the corporate entities. You take that same letter to the editor, make it a comment on Cleveland.com, and Cleveland.com is immune from liability for publishing it. There's something wrong there. There's something wrong there because I represented newspapers for 40 years, and before that, I was a journalist. And I worked in Pittsburgh in a major market. At that time, we were, I think, the 10th largest broadcast market. I worked in broadcast market in the United States. We were careful about what we said, partially to avoid legal liability and partially because of the conventions of journalism that prevailed then and prevail today with the mainstream press. There is a lot of vetting. There's a lot of concern about getting it wrong. Where that's in the mainstream press. I believe that's not at all true for the right-wing media that is like Newsmax or Fox. And I think that with respect to bloggers, the predominant right-wing bloggers or right-wing information generators on social media, they don't have any of those conventions. I'm exaggerating. They don't have those conventions. Some don't have any, but some like Fox do have conventions, but they are not as meticulous as the rest of them, as the traditional mainstream press.
Mark, can you just give us kind of a
general... I wanted to, before you, I wanted to say what the problem is when Cleveland.com cannot be held liable for what the letter to the editor says that's published on Cleveland.com, then Cleveland.com is not interested in whether that letter is false, disparaging, or whatever it says. When that same letter is submitted to the plain dealer is, and I can tell you as a lawyer who represented the plain dealer for decades, they cared about what the letter to the editor said. They vetted that letter to the editor. They weren't going to publish something that they concluded was false and defamatory, or that they concluded posed a significant risk that it was false and defamatory. That's good. That's a good thing. I think I was always an absolute. I used to be an absolutist when it came to the First Amendment. I'm less so now. I can sort of see how libel law serves a good purpose. It does cause those who are going to mass distribute information. Libel law does cause them to be careful not to publish false and damaging information. And Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides the immunity I described in my hypothetical about Cleveland.com, is what protects Facebook, X, and all the other social media platforms from legal liability. Now, what does that really amount to? It amounts to a federal subsidy of Facebook, of X. It's a subsidy. Why is it a subsidy? Because if you didn't have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, there could be damages liability for these companies for allowing false and defamatory and other kinds of damaging information on their platforms. They are being subsidized by the federal government so that they don't have to worry about those sometimes catastrophic costs and expenses. They can build their business without having to worry about that. And they also don't have to pay journalists to create content. Their content is free. The citizenry provides the content.
Right. And there's a lot more to it than that. I can assure you that when we follow the bouncing ball of the Heritage Foundation and Koch level funding for a lot of different infused variances of propaganda, that doesn't go into lightly just simply having morons say moronic things about people that are untrue. There's a whole nother component of it that's Joseph Goebbels like. Now, that's just a statement based on what I've seen in the litany of these millions of lies per day that have completely dissolved, or shall I say erased, in this weird, almost science fiction like way, the American people's ability to recognize fact for being something important to how our government runs. And I want to turn this question to you, Marc. Can you just give us the basics, the primer of the First Amendment in this context of this conversation, right? But in terms of your position as the former Attorney General of the state of Ohio, and then of course in your private practice and what you do in consumer lawsuits and so on and so forth, the importance both from a legal construct and also a journalistic construct, what is the importance of transparency and accuracy, particularly to a democracy in the context of the way the First Amendment was written?
Well, when I have a First Amendment question, I call the guy who's below me on my screen here, David Marburger, to help me figure it out. So I'm going to defer to him about that. And I have a question I want to pose to him after I finish answering this question. But so look, I sue people all the time for making promises about their products that turn out not to be true, we have everything from peanut butter with that had bacteria in it, to cases where financial services companies are telling people that the interest rate is X, and the true interest rate on a payday loan is 10 times X. And there just seems to be no reason why these information businesses shouldn't be held to the same or a similar standard. But if I were to sue X for propagating false information, I'd probably get sanctioned by the court, because under this Section 230, the liability or the lack of liability is so clear that there's not a basis to sue. And yet we live in a world, and I think this is what I wanted to kind of put in front of David. We live in a world where 60 Minutes, the most reliable, respected, one of the most reliable, respected broadcast journalism outlets in the history, in the history of modern media, is at the point of having to either capitulate to the Trump administration, based on a libel lawsuit that was filed against them, or go away. And their efforts, and I think what they've decided to do is go down swinging until their corporate parent finally gives up, and so they've got to be accountable. But the massive lies that are flowing through social media, through the subsidy that David described, they go completely unanswered and completely and are allowed to do it completely unaccountably. So the question to you, David, is, how did we get here, and how do we get out of this?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
There was, Biden had advocated revoking Section 230. Trump had advocated revoking Section 230, but for two completely different reasons. Trump wanted to revoke Section 230 because at that time, Twitter and to some extent Facebook were more actively policing what was on their sites. And Trump's view was, you're excluding the right-wing point of view. Biden wanted to revoke Section 230 because of the vast misinformation that Section 230 allows to be published to millions of people. I'm on the Biden side of that. And I don't know. I mean, people are debating what to do about each problem. In other words, Trump's problem, which I think is illegitimate, Trump's purported problem, which I think is illegitimate, is considered to be a reason for attacking Section 230, and Biden's rationale is the same. I hate Section 230, although I did believe we should try to revoke it. I now think that's probably too difficult to do because the social media companies do more than just propagate speech about public affairs or speech about social issues. They also are a key part of commerce. A lot of commerce is transacted through at least Facebook, and I know other platforms. That will make it hard. There could be a real economic hit to revoking Section 230 altogether. Now, Section 230, it does protect like Facebook from advertisements that make the kinds of false statements you were describing that you sue companies over. It does protect Facebook, although it wouldn't protect the company that originates the advertising. But I would like to see Section 230 vastly weakened. I'd like to see that immunity vastly retreat. And I'm not convinced that revoking it would be so terrible, but I do, terrible economically, I mean. But I do acknowledge that so much economic activity occurs on the social media websites that if you revoke Section 230 altogether, would it be a problem economically for the country, given what else we're having to wrestle with at the moment? Nonetheless, it is plainly good when a mass communicator has to be concerned about truth. It is plainly good when a mass communicator has to be concerned about speech that injures other people and harms them. That's, to me, plainly good. And when you remove that, I think only the citizens, you might say, oh, the citizens gets to say whatever they want. Isn't that wonderful? But it seems to me, empirically, it's not wonderful. We can see it's not wonderful. It's that citizens are told that vaccines are terrible. Citizens are told that that somebody did something they didn't do. And the people who are really exploiting social media are very good at it. They're very good at being Joseph Goebbels. They're good. And again, it isn't just the MAGA types either. There are because you can make money if you get a lot of clicks. There are people in our country and outside our country that intentionally propagate false, alarming information in order, clickbait. In order to produce clicks, they make money on it. We have allowed, and that's another reason why 230 has got to go. Somebody has got to create a disincentive for these people who are making money on clickbait associated with false and injurious speech. Somebody has got to police it, and it's not going to be like the Federal Trade Commission. It ought to be the platforms that are making hundreds of millions of dollars from people posting false or true information on their websites.
Well,
Right.
but David, why not go after and I found your answer when we talked about this earlier. Your answer to this very interesting. Why not go after them in the same way that Trump's gone after CBS, or NBC or other news outlets? Why not bring libel cases against those clickbait producers, assuming you can find them, which is another problem. Yeah.
Well. Let me answer that in two ways. You mentioned the consumer protection stuff.
Yeah.
The suit against CBS, which is based on the editing on 60 Minutes of Kamala Harris's remarks during a 60 Minutes interview, which is completely there was nothing bad or harmful or false or bad about that editing. Everybody edits. CBS was not making any misrepresentations. Nonetheless, the lawsuit wasn't for libel. It was under a consumer protection law in Texas. And the same thing happened to the Des Moines Register, where Trump is using a consumer protection law in Iowa to say that the Des Moines Register's the polling columnist, she predicted that Harris was going to win, well in Iowa, and Kamala Harris lost. So Trump sues. He's using a consumer protection statute against the columnist and against the Des Moines Register, saying that they misled consumers with CBS's editing of the Kamala Harris interview, or the pollster, making a mistake on the poll. The reason you don't sue under libel, though, and I don't know much about the consumer protection statutes, but the reason your question was about libel. The problem with suing for libel is one that we reckoned with often in my firm. I'm retired from Baker Hostetler, which is a big media law firm throughout my career and before. We had clients who, within the press, that wanted to sue for libel sometimes. And we recommended against it, and I still would. And that's because if you win, you lose. That is, if you sue for libel and you win, you're going to create a precedent if you're at the appellate level. And if you win in that precedent, you're going to make it easier for more people to sue for libel. More speakers are going to be vulnerable. So if you make law, if you win, you're going to make law at the appellate level. The law you make is going to restrict what's free to say. It's going to make it harder for speakers to speak, even to speak in good faith, even to speak the truth. It's well known that at least 2 justices on the Supreme Court are very skeptical that New York Times versus Sullivan, a landmark First Amendment case that protects speech, that Justices Gorsuch and Thomas have expressed skepticism that New York Times versus Sullivan should continue to exist. Well, if you start suing, if you, a free speech proponent, sues somebody for libel and you succeed, you ultimately lose. You could be the guy that gets rid of New York Times versus Sullivan and the great protections associated with that decision.
Okay, but I want to challenge that from this perspective. So I asked this question from the beginning, but we've kind of gone off on the details of 220. But the basic standards of the First Amendment, of course, guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right of people to petition the government to redress grievances. Okay, that's the basics, right? So we have these standards, and we've grown up, guys like me grew up in the 70s where we had 3 networks, and, it was the Walter Cronkite sort of standard, right? There was a trust, okay? And then in the 90s, we ended up seeing media take a different turn where you give the people what they want. Then over the course of the last 20 years, we've seen this proliferation of social media that has led to organized manipulation and deception and diabolical propaganda. Now, in the form of what? I mean, I just prefaced what we talked about initially with the Koch brothers and all things, the Heritage Foundation, which is now led into the Project 2025 and all of the technocrats that are dismantling government right before our eyes, much of which is, of course, illegal. So at least constitutionally, right? But yet, in the meantime, the nature of waste, fraud, and abuse is such that there's nothing backing that with the detailed information that is, blown up 6 or 7 days later. We all know the adage that a lie travels around the world 6 times before the truth gets its pants on. And here we have the richest man in the world operating a front for a group that includes some of the largest private equity companies in the world, some of the largest hedge fund operators, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, a couple of Russian billionaire oligarchs. And there's these systems behind there propagating echo chambers of insane nonsense. The stuff that I'm watching right now with President Trump in Saudi Arabia is propping him up to be this imagery like Vladimir Putin or Kim Il-jong, right? This massive propaganda, but undergirded by, you could just deconstruct most of these different, I would call them bots. If you had the capacity to do the investigation, to get underneath all of the the engineering of what X is, you could easily, I can just tell based on what I'm seeing and knowing where we came from, by the way, which is deconstructing massive corruption and fraud. And I'm going to throw this in there just to compound this even further, because it is complicated, particularly as we're talking about libel as it relates to free speech and freedom of the press. This isn't freedom of the press. What this is manipulation of psychology to give the people what they want, which are mostly an echo chamber to instill their own ignorance, right? Whether it's KKK or racism or whatever, you can just get combinations of all of these different things all over the place. But yet, it's huge business. It's ginormous. The technology companies are, helmed by these billionaires that are involved with the likes of, let's say, Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel's famous case with Gawker was he didn't like Gawker, which was
I was in that case.
You were in that case.
Okay. I was pulled into that case to represent the editor-in-chief of Gawker after Hulk Hogan won his $140 million civil judgment.
Right. Okay, so you're the expert in all of this stuff in addition to what
I don't know that I'm the expert, but I was personally involved.
But the bottom line is I'm talking about weaponization of lies and manipulation that are obvious to anybody who had the time. So I'm going to tie these things together.
Well, what Thiel did was bankrolled the lawsuit for Hulk Hogan. That's what he did.
Right.
He bankrolled it.
Yeah, but it goes on and on and on, and that's what these guys have been doing forever to intimidate anybody, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's the Washington Post or anybody who has the goods to do the investigation. Because I'm just going to tie this up in this bow what the Supreme Court said about corruption, right? In terms of knighting Donald Trump a king because of what they did with the 14th Amendment, right? The notion is that corruption is you've got to prove every aspect of what's gone into the quid pro quo. You got to have the murder weapon. You got to have the emails. You got to have the evidence. You got to have the black bag. You got to have the cash. You got to have the actual translation or the recorded, conversation of who did what, when, and how, and what they were for to be able to prove the quid pro quo. But you can't do that without the investigation. The investigation is the New York Times or those, investigative journalists that can actually have the resources to have the compunction that go and they determine all of these truths so that the American people can see the forest for the trees and find out who's lying to them so they can hold them accountable at the ballot box. So none of that works when it gets so jammed up with lies and distortion and dissemination of lies for propaganda usage. So how do you quell that without?
I'm telling you, the way I think the way you get the biggest bang for your buck is you remove the federal subsidy. If Facebook had to police the content on its own platform, that's going to have a massively wider impact than any like a libel suit. A libel suit will take years, and what will it get you?
Interesting.
What will it really get you? So it's like if you don't like sand, you have two ways to attack sand. One grain at a time that's on the beach, or just wipe out the beach. My view is wipe out the beach.
Well, okay, so
don't try to attack the beach one grain of sand at a time. Do something about the whole beach.
So who would be behind something like that, Mark? Like, wouldn't that have to be a national movement to understand what's at stake? And maybe, I don't know, the Democratic Party, for example, wouldn't that be something central to a platform that would actually be to restore democracy, for example?
Well, they're too busy sending me fundraising texts right now to focus on anything like this. But yeah, I mean, legislatively, certainly there's a way to attack it. But David, I'm intrigued thinking about, I can't, if I use UDAP statute, unfair and deceptive business practice statutes to attack some of these folks who are propagating lies, then I don't put Times versus Sullivan at risk. So that might be a strategy you would approve of.
I'm thinking about it because
okay.
Times versus Sullivan also applies outside of strict libel law. It applies to libel law's functional equivalent. That is, the First Amendment protections that we are familiar with in libel also apply in other legal theories that try to get around the First Amendment protections. And so how that would, do you run that same sort of risk, even if your theory isn't libel? And the answer is you might. You might.
Yeah, but I'm thinking, I know probably more about these state unfair and deceptive business practice laws than many lawyers in the country. And I don't know how he wins that case. I don't know how CBS could even have a modicum of fear of losing that case.
I agree with you. And I don't think that CBS per se has a modicum of fear. What seems to be happening with the Trumps is that Trump recognizes that behind the journalists are business people, and those business people have interests that are not limited to the journalism that's being attacked. So,
Right.
with respect to the George Stephanopoulos matter and the rape, well, ABC is owned by Disney. Disney has a whole lot of considerations beyond ABC. CBS is owned by Paramount.
Paramount, who's owned by Sherry Redstone now. Right.
Yes, they have interests beyond the journalism. You remember CBS didn't start out that way, and neither did ABC. They used to be their own corporations, so the journalism was their lifeblood. Right. Now those big corporations, the journalism, while certainly very important to them, is not their lifeblood to the same extent that the journalism was when ABC was a standalone corporation or CBS was a standalone corporation. So Trump recognizes that the controllers of these journalism organizations are themselves business people with an array of business interests that interact with the federal government. Just as Bezos has business interests that interact with the federal government that are not Amazon. And Trump recognizes that, and that's where he goes. That's where the pressure is being put. If and in other words, you're not going to get that contract you need with the federal government, or you're not going to get that merger approved by the federal government, that by the DOJ, just the Department of Justice, unless you play ball. And so now the business people are thinking, well, how much would it cost to settle the suit? What would we have to do? Well, to some extent, it's awful. We're going to provide X millions of dollars to some organization that Trump favors, and he favors it because of its ideological position. But look, the people in my profession, they're doing the same thing. The law firms are, the big law firms get faced with abuses of federal power. That is, we're not going to let anybody. You represented Hillary Clinton, so no one from your firm is going to be allowed into a federal building. Well, some of the law firms, now the law firm that represented Hillary didn't cave, but some of the other big law firms who had represented Trump adversaries did cave, and they promised to devote millions of free legal dollars to representing ideological positions that Trump favors personally. He's using the power of the federal government to extract millions of promises of millions of dollars of free legal help to support positions that he personally champions. And a lot of people are outraged by that, and should be. But
okay,
I certainly am.
But let me introduce this though, because this goes back. Okay, come on, this isn't something new, by the way. 60 Minutes was faced with the same conundrum back during The Insider, that became that movie, of course, starring was it Pacino? Do you guys remember the guy about
the tobacco whistleblower?
This is like mid '90s, right? Okay, and so they capitulated.
Well, that was ABC got sued by by Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company.
Well, yeah, but it was also because of 60 Minutes, and they quashed some of the. So this goes back to the quashing the whistleblowers and all of the other elements. And again, what brought us to Marc, Dan, and what we understand about deceptive acts and practices, particularly as it goes up the food chain to these CEOs at these high-level financial firms that basically run the country, for example, right? Yeah, they can quash the truth in every which way to Sunday to maintain this insider, benefit whatever trade or whatever the government has got to be able to approve because of a mega merger and yada, yada, yada. But in the meantime, what happens to the American people, right? The American people are blitzkrieged, literally blitzkrieged with lies and stupidity all day, every day, 24 hours a day.
But would that happen if the platform, if the the social media companies were liable for what people published
Right, but what's the gateway
on their platforms.
I totally
Well,
agree.
would
But
that happen?
I totally agree. But what's the gateway without, like, you made the metaphor earlier about, okay, are you going to go after a grain of sand or you're going to go after the whole beach? Yeah, I want to go after the whole beach. But in this particular case, some grains of sand are bigger than others. So you've got Elon Musk, who's the face of a consortium of a massive global racketeering propaganda arm that's using, like, why, for example, let me ask you this question, just to kind of for instance. So the Supreme Court, obviously 6 months before the election, basically effectively stated that the president is above the law, right? That he's immune to
the immunity decision, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so given that, did Biden have any opportunities to use that power to actually try to, on behalf of the American people, using the resources of the Department of Justice and FBI, based on some of these, I don't know what the actual legal term is. That's why I was asking about the basics by way of freedom of speech and freedom of the press and so on and so forth. But these are propaganda outlets that, if we're going to use a consumer protection sort of scenario, they're selling poison. People are dying. There's got to be some sort of remedy, or some people withstanding, right, that are either victims of libel or victims of something that is ongoing, whether they're celebrities or politicians or someone. I know what the threshold is, right? But my question is, how do you outsmart this system to turn the tables? I know you got to go after 220, right? But is there
230?
230.
230.
But is there a way to? I mean, Elon Musk made himself the face of this whole thing. He's the richest guy in the world. He's got the deepest pockets. It seems like it's propaganda, right? I mean, there is no ands, ifs, or buts about it. Help me through this. How do you take this?
You seem to suggest that you sue for libel the larger grain of sand, but let's take Sarah Palin's libel suit against the New York Times, which I supported the New York Times. My own view in reading what I've read about the case is that the New York Times was right. I was okay. I was okay with what the New York Times did, although the New York Times was criticized for it by responsible critics. Look how long it took her to get 2 trials and to lose both of them. And who knows if she'll appeal. She'd already appealed the first one, was sent back for another trial. I assume she's going to appeal the most recent verdict, which was, I think, in April. Look how long it takes. And the New York Times is a big giant. The New York Times is a big deal. If she, her goal was to win that in the appellate level and get rid of New York Times versus Sullivan as a precedent. Well, look how much luck she's having. Now, even if she succeeded, what's that really? If she would have succeeded in getting rid of New York Times versus Sullivan, that would be like getting rid of the beach instead of 1 grain of sand. But that's not the way you want to win. I don't think the way you want to win is to get rid of speech protections for those who originate speech. What you want to do is incentivize the big platforms to police the content that they facilitate. That's what you want. You want them they have the most control over those platforms. Give them a big incentive to police the content that they facilitate. I believe getting rid of or greatly modifying Section 230 would do that. And I don't think it would hurt speech at all, because the originators of the speech, their liability doesn't change.
Right.
But the purveyor, the one that's really purveying it, their liability does change, but it changes in a good way. That is, they're finally going to be responsible for the content that they're spreading all over the world.
It sounds good to me, Mark. How do you do it?
Well, but then I was going to ask David. So get rid of 230. What else? What else is it possible? And again, I don't know if there's an answer to this. What else can be done to create a world where we can once again rely on the information that's being shared with us as a democracy, as citizens, what else? What else is that we can do? Is there any? Given your, more years probably than you want to admit. What, 50 years of litigating 40 years of litigating First Amendment cases anyway? What else is there out there that we can, or that Congress could do, or that the Democrats could advocate for, that would create a world where truth again has more value than lies?
Well, think about this. I'm not going to suggest an alternative that I think would work, but I will suggest a way of thinking about it. All of society relies on a legal regime. So, for example, suppose in our legal regime, you couldn't own property. Imagine what kind of economy we would have. We'd have a zero economy. If you couldn't own land, if you couldn't own goods and services, we'd be screwed. It's the legal regime that shapes the economy. It's the legal regime that shapes what people say without having to worry about liability. And so if you construct, but our problem is you can't construct a legal regime that says, for example, the FTC will decide whether statements made on social media or on Fox News are appropriate or not. You don't want to give government administrators that kind of power over speech. My own view is the legal regime is helpful in shaping speech if you remove the subsidies for false speech. And that's where I come back to Section 230. It's a big federal subsidy that doesn't exist for all of mass media. It only really exists for social media and other websites that behave like social media.
David, do you know how we ended up with Section 230 to begin with?
Generally, yes, I do know. I was around when it was adopted. What was happening was when AOL and other online services like it were behaving as simple bulletin boards, so that people were posting defamatory comments on them, but they weren't sophisticated. This was back in the 90s. So there were some lawsuits to impose liability on the bulletin boards. And these lawsuits didn't go very far in the legal system, but they created written opinions that alarmed a lot of people because liability was, it looked like it was going to be a likelihood. Well, at that time, the internet was new and we had not really tapped into all its various uses. And so in order to allow the internet to flourish as a means of public discourse and for electronic commerce, Congress passed the Section 230 in the Communications Decency Act. And the beginning of Section 230, Congress makes like findings, or it describes the rationale for adopting it. But I think that rationale has lost its way in the sense that these platforms are not simple bulletin boards anymore. They use algorithms to connect people with content. They do a lot of orchestration for what content I see on a Facebook page. It'll be if I've been shopping for a Mazda, suddenly I'm going to get Mazda ads. There's going to be if it appears that I'm interested in certain kinds of websites that are non-commercial, I'll get links or sort of little snippets about other websites of similar topics. This is being done by the platforms. They're doing it. They're not acting like neutral little bulletin boards. They're trying to increase clicks or increase revenue for themselves and certain customers by using sophisticated algorithms to keep you linked to certain content.
Our phone.
I think it's time to make them responsible for these things.
Our phone listens to us and gives us the information that it knows we're searching for. I experience it every day. But David, two more things because we're running out of time here. Look, we had the Dominion lawsuit, of course, because of the Fox big lie and everything that was around the 2020 election, and they got sued, and they settled. Murdoch settled for $787 million, which was a tiny piece of their $11 billion operating budget for circa 2020, I guess 2019. So it's a drop in the bucket for these guys, but they didn't even experience any diminished ratings as a result of that. Their business model, as Murdoch had projected, was to lie. He effectively said that publicly. That's what we do. And therein lies, some of the stuff that went into the settlement and so on and so forth. So how do you, I guess the counter, which you're also an expert in, and which you've been on the front lines of, and which folks like Marc, Dann rely on, is transparency, right? Haven't you been on the front lines, whether it's within pensions or with all sorts of government or even business, I guess, goings on, the ability to get that information? I know we call it in journalism FOIA a lot of the time, which gets suppressed. But if you can bring those two things together, starting with the lessons, if you will, of the Dominion lawsuit against Fox, and how that fits into kind of what we're talking about today, and then maybe bridge it to transparency based on your experience.
It's a lot.
Well, that's a small ask.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we only have a couple of seconds to go, or a minute to go.
Well, but, we can schedule again if you'd prefer, but just in case.
Look, the kind of transparency that I think I'm an expert in is the open government laws, open records laws, and how to enforce them, and what they ought to say and what they do say, and that sort of thing. And while that's vital to trying to keep government honest, and can be vital to combat lies that are spread by speakers, I don't know how that connects really to the Dominion voting machine stuff. Let me say this, and I think this is something that, this is a little bit of a radical thought, but it's something I believe. I think to some extent, New York Times versus Sullivan, the precedent that I think is good to protect, it has a big loophole that places like Fox News exploit. And we learned this especially in the Dominion voting machine case. The way New York Times versus Sullivan works is if you're defaming falsely somebody in public life, most specifically a government official, but it can be a non-government person who's a public figure, that person who's being defamed cannot succeed without proving not just falsehood, not just that you injured, you said something disparaging about that person, but also cannot succeed unless they show that the speaker knew what they were saying was false, or were highly aware that it was probably false. Now, it looks to me that Fox exploits that by what Fox will do is some fringe person out there will say something outrageous, like Sidney Powell. They will quote her and say, well, we didn't know it was false. She's what she said seemed newsworthy to us. We didn't know it was false. So the First Amendment protects us. Well, that's a loophole in New York Times versus Sullivan, and it's a negative. It's a negative element of New York Times versus Sullivan that Fox News seems to exploit, and seems to do it on purpose. Now, what to do about that, I don't know. I don't want to see New York Times versus Sullivan go away, but I do see how it facilitates people who, in my opinion, that's really not good faith. That's just exploiting a legal loophole, even though you're acting in, I think, bad faith.
But
and I think Fox was nervous enough about it that they settled that case for $600 million. So I think they thought that might go in a bad direction for them too at the end of the day.
Look, I'll close with this. The truth apparently has no value. All the American people buy are lies. Okay. that's reality.
I sort of agree with you. I mean, you're exaggerating it, but you are right. If well, you are right. The truth has value to those who value the truth, but that's not the majority. That seems to be millions of people don't really value it that much. Although you'll notice that people who are misinformed are not any less outspoken about it. In other words, they rely on the false information to reach and express their conclusions. I remember my grandmother, who was well educated, but when she was old in the 1970s, she once said to me, and by then I was a working journalist. She said, "Well, the only way you get the truth is from the National Enquirer. It's the supermarket tabloids were the only way you could get the truth." And I'm thinking, those of us who are even, are more, have been educated more recently, don't believe that. I guess, some people believe what appeals to them.
Mark,
And we also have something that used to never happen, but it happens all the time now, where you have a huge cacophony of government voices, especially government voices, who are attacking the mainstream press as being false news. That is complete baloney. That is total baloney. Nobody vets the news as well as the mainstream press. Nobody does. Nobody has the personnel to vet the news. Nobody has the first-hand news gatherers to vet the news. That isn't to say that the mainstream press is always true. But when it's not true, it's through human error or some failing that they can't control. If they can be truthful, they are. They try to be reliable, is what they try to be.
There are professionals in mainstream media that are at that standard, but we also know that hedge funds and private equity have bought newspapers around the country for the last 20 years, and their business model is not truth, particularly where their interests are involved. You said it yourself earlier. That's what we've been looking at through this corporate juggernaut over the last 20 years. And I'm curious, Mark.
I don't agree with that.
Well, okay, fine, but at the same time, okay, I'll tell you what I know in terms of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. We know that Marc Dann found the only racketeering and convicted the only mid-level 90 million a year racketeering effort that he got a RICO conviction on, that the entire financial system was doing, that was never held account. And that means tens of millions of people went through the freaking meat grinder of this story. How do I know? Because we told the story. That's what brought us to Marc Dann. We've seen this thing soup to nuts. And what that means is most news organizations have starved the investigation departments of resources.
Eliminated.
Of course, because it's not part of their business model. That's my point. And so what I'm asking maybe Marc to give us a closing argument, because I find myself, it's ridiculous that the American people, okay, we want jobs, right? We want to have in the Midwest, we want to rehabilitate the Rust Belt into this, this shiny new dynamic industrial powerhouse, because Donald Trump said, we're going to make America great again, and the tariffs are going to fit into that, but they have no idea that there's no plan to actually do that, that the tariffs are going to be putting money directly into Donald Trump's pockets and all of the other things that we've seen. And to hold him account, well, maybe none of these, institutions or the New York Times and everybody else can keep up with the amount of lies that they're trying to play defense.
I agree with that.
So Marc, take us home in a way, because you are a new untouchable. You've done it in government. You've taken it with the racketeering. You know how to fight these guys in the courts where truth is everything, and you got to win over the jury of the American people. But there is nothing, in my opinion, more valuable than truth. And I'll take it one step further. We all know that, we expect our systems to function, right? We expect the plane to fly. We expect the building to stand. We expect the brakes on our cars to work, right? What happens if we find out that the whole thing is a setup so that a company behind the scenes who insurance can do all sorts of things they did in the 2008? I'm like making it way too broad, but you know where I'm coming from, Marc.
Well, but let me narrow it down. I think what I'm taking away from this, which I think, and David, thank you. I found this really, really helpful and inspirational. Is one, I think we have to emphasize supporting those entities that continue to do the investigative journalism, to to produce the truth. I mean, to support, some of them are independent, very independent newsletters now that where they're doing, whether it's the what is it, the what's the big organization, David, that provides content for free to,
ProPublica?
ProPublica.
ProPublica is good.
ProPublica. I read
By
or
the
the
way, we
American
work closely with ProPublica in our work, by the way, just so you know, with David Eisinger, who
yeah,
can pull all this stuff
yeah.
up.
So we need to support those things. The nonprofit model has started to take on some traction in local news and coverage of local news. Because I mean, I think what Patrick was referring to here in Ohio, David, is we've run up against, and I just won a public records battle in the 10th District Court of Appeals against the state teachers retirement system, who won't provide information about the performance of the private equity funds that they've acquired on behalf of the retired teachers in the state. And I can't get any of the newspapers in the state because either they're completely leveraged by private equity, like Advance News that owns the Cleveland papers, or they're owned outright by the hedge funds and private equity funds that STRS is investing in. And so we've got to find a new model, and we got to figure out how to support that. So I think that's something that we can all do in our lives is think about, maybe get rid of a streaming service subscription and replace it with a subscription to an enterprise that's actually reporting truthful information. So that's one positive thing that we can do. We can keep thinking about and talking about legal strategies as well. And then I think the Democrats need to wrap their arms around the repeal of Section 230. A perfect opportunity to do that would be to offer amendments to the upcoming big, beautiful budget bill. You know what they want? They're going to need votes for that. Is that an opportunity? If it's not that, where is it next? Where is the opportunity? And maybe David will go home or spend tonight thinking about a legal strategy to attack 230 on constitutional basis. That we could muster at some point here. So I haven't thought of it yet, but I'm certainly not as smart as you are. So hopefully you can come up. Yeah, you can come up with that going forward. I beg for that one, but seriously, I mean, I think that's I think a focus on the truth. It seems so old fashioned, and it seemed and it's not something we had to worry about before. Growing up in the 70s, like David, I didn't worry about the fact that the information that was being provided to us was false. And our kids have grown up in exactly that environment where most of the information they're getting is not true. It's kept people from voting. It's turned them against engagement with democracy. So I think we included in our efforts to make this right needs to be at least some attention to supporting those entities that are trying to get the truth out, and they're out there, and they're worthy of our help.
Well, I'll conclude this and say thank you to you both, to Mark and to David, and I'll put links to your work below. But I'll finish with my.
Wait, one more thing about David. If anybody's, so he is the only lawyer I know whose deposition transcript has been reenacted by the Upright Citizens Brigade. And Patrick, I sent you that link to the video of that, and it is unbelievable. He all about all about the definition of what a copy was.
Photocopying machine.
Right. Yeah, what a photocopying machine was.
Photocopying machine in your office. What do you mean by photocopying machine? I thought, oh, this is baloney.
Right.
And but it's not like 13 pages of
right. Right, but
it's not improv. What do you mean by photocopying machine? And I'm saying, well, I want the court to know that you don't know. You're the head of the information technology for the county recorder's office, and you don't know what a photocopying machine is? Is that what the court should be understanding?
Interesting point. I'm thinking of registry of deeds along those lines, Mark.
No, I mean, but you should watch it, and people should watch it because that's not improv. That's David and a witness, a live witness for 13 pages of
it's all actors. It's actors.
Well, the actors are reenacting the transcript.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll include that link below, and I'll offer my own conclusion, David. And I hope you know where I'm coming from this, because this has really been kind of my mission from day one, to kind of sift through this juggernaut of lies that has completely, uncovered. I mean, become our country. I mean, Trump's business model is lying. That's all it is,
without question.
And it's insane. And so what I remind our viewers, and this is the prescient point, that when you live in light, you live in truth. When you live in truth, when you live in light. When you live a lie, you're depraved. When you live a truth, you're bulletproof. When you live a lie, inside you die. And this is what I think the solution is. Stop lying, stop buying lies. And on that note, I'll say thank you to you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And we'll talk.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, David.